Counterspells in Commander can be very, very powerful, and most of them are in blue, but there are a few non-blue options or similar options that can be pretty powerful. So here's a tier list for all of those. I'm going to start with Reprieve. It's not technically a counterspell because it doesn't counter the spell, but it's actually a little bit better in that regard since you can bounce uncounterable spells back to your opponent's hand. At the end of the day, it's just a remand, and remand isn't very good in Commander. I would say this kind of requires synergy. If you're a Sunforger deck and this is like a utility piece you can grab, maybe it's worth it. But outside of that, I probably wouldn't play it. Next is a classic, Mana Tithe. 1 white for an instant, counter target spell unless its controller pays 1. And it's decent. It's fine. It falls off really hard in the late game, but anytime your opponent taps out, it's 1 white to counter that spell, and because it hits any spell, it's relatively flexible. Probably just better than Reprieve, honestly. Next is Autumn's Veil and Veil of Summer. These are kinda like counter spells. They sort of give your stuff hexproof and make them uncounterable, so it's kinda like a counter spell in a counter war. I think Autumn's Veil is kind of not great unless you're all in on some sort of combo that you need to protect. It's sort of mid. Veil of Summer does draw a card, so because it cantrips, it makes it quite a bit better. I think Veil of Summer could be good if you're playing some sort of combo deck where you really need certain spells to resolve. It's probably the best one of the two. I really wouldn't play Autumn's Veil unless you absolutely needed it, like there's a lot of blue in your meta and you really need to resolve spells. But there's better ways to give uncounterable to certain things in green. Next is Tibalt's Trickery, which does straight up counter a spell, and then at random, your opponent will mill some cards and then flip into another spell and cast that for free. And Tibalt's Trickery is decently playable. It's sort of like the Chaos Warp of counter spells, because you do give your opponent something, although Chaos Warp is better since if they flip a non-permanent off the top, they just get nothing. Tibalt's Trickery is one of the only red spells that can counter anything, so because of that, it's still pretty good. Next up is Pyroblast and Red Elemental Blast. I'm going to put both of these in the staple tier. These cards are straight up really powerful. Because they act as removal on board, not just a counterspell, they don't have that counterspell restriction of, if I don't mess with this on the stack, I can't do anything with it later. Being able to destroy a Rhystic Study that's already in play for 1 mana, or blow up an Urza for 1 mana, is super powerful and really good value. They're both pretty similar in power level. There are some niche things you can do with redirecting that makes Red Elemental Blast slightly better. But other than that, they're both really powerful cards, and if you're in mono red, I would highly consider playing them. There's a lot of blue enchantments that are tough to deal with. Not of This World is a 7 mana instant, tribal instant Eldrazi, that lets you counter target spell or ability that targets a permanent you control. It does cost 7 less, so it's free. If it targets a creature you control with power 7 or greater, honestly, even in an Eldrazi deck, even if I had like Kozilek in the command zone, I don't know if I'm playing this card. Like, yeah, you get rid of my Kozilek, but now I just recast it and get the cast trigger. It's not even that bad for me. I'm not sure why I would want this really bad counterspell in my deck to protect my Kozilek that I want to recast anyway. This card's just pretty bad. Next is Dawn Charm, which is a card I actually play a decent bit. White 1 for an instant, prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn, regenerate target creature, or counter target spell that targets you. The actual counterspell portion of this card is pretty niche. Unless you're getting hit with like a Mind Twist, it doesn't come up too often in Commander, but the other 2 modes are pretty strong. Regenerating a creature and preventing all combat damage that would be dealt is also really nice. The spell works super well in a Sunforger deck because of the 3 modes. You can tutor it up in 3 different scenarios where you need it. I think this card's totally playable, and if you're in a white deck that would want any one of these modes regularly, Dawn Charm is definitely worth it, because the other 2 do show up occasionally, and it's a great rate for those effects. Rebuff the Wicked is another mono white counterspell. Counters a spell that targets a permanent you control. So I think this kind of requires a bit of synergy. If you're playing a deck that really wants to protect its commander, then this is a really efficient way to do so, since it doesn't matter what they throw at it, you can just counter the spell, even if it's exile removal or what. If you don't have a specific permanent that you really want in play, it's not great. Like if you're a go wide deck, people are going to play board wipes against you and those don't target, so Rebuff the Wicked doesn't really work there. So I would say only if you want to really protect your commander. Like if you're a Voltron deck, then Rebuff the Wicked is good because you can definitely protect your commander for pretty cheap too. Withering Boon is one of my favorite cards, and it goes right up into the staple category. I think this card, especially in mono black in Commander, is phenomenal. So black has really great creature removal, but part of the problem with creature removal is it doesn't stop enter the battlefield effects. If your opponent casts like a Dockside Extortionist, yeah, you might have a Doomblade to get rid of it, but they already got a billion treasures and won the game. Withering Boon is one of the ways in mono black to stop enter the battlefield effects. And 2 mana to counter a creature spell, at worst in a game, you're just going to counter your opponent's commander at some point. It's not that bad. It's pretty good. I like Withering Boon a lot. It's a great card. If you're in mono black, give it a try. Lapse of Certainty is another great card. 2 and a white for essentially a memory lapse. It counters any spell, but it goes on top of its owner's library. In mono white, I think this is the best counterspell. Counters anything without any conditions. 3 mana is not great. It would have been really good if this was like white. A memory lapse effect is decently powerful in certain situations. It doesn't get rid of the thing you want to counter permanently, but sometimes putting it back on top of your opponent's library and forcing them to draw the same card again can be a huge tempo swing. I love Lapse a lot and played in quite a few of my white decks that don't have blue. Guttural Response is hybrid Gruul for an instant that says counter target blue instant. And as much as I love this card in Modern back in the day, it is not very good in Commander. Not only is it color specific, but it's only blue instants. If your opponent casts an Expropriate, there's nothing you can do with a Guttural Response. And considering you have to be in red to play this, you might as well just play Red Ele Blast and Pyroblast instead. Both of those are just straight up better. And I don't see a deck where you'd want Red Elemental Blast, Pyroblast, and Tibalt's Trickery, and also Guttural Response. This would be some sort of really weird deck where you're like mono red counterspells or Gruul counterspells, which is a fun idea for a deck. I have to think about that. But goofy decks aside, I don't think realistically you're going to be playing Guttural Response in anything. Avoid Fate is kind of a bad Rebuff the Wicked. It only counters instants and auras that target permanents you control, so sorcery speed removal just goes past this. Granted, most people's spot removal is instant speed, so I would say it's like the bottom of requires synergy tier. If you are a Voltron commander and you're mono green and you really don't want people popping your stuff, Avoid Fate can be good, although I wouldn't really play it. The art is sweet though, this is some awesome Phil Foglio art. Burnout is basically Guttural Response for 1 more mana that draws a card, which I suppose makes it probably better than Guttural Response, because 2 mana is not that bad and it cantrips, but still not good. Artifact Blast is a card that I had not seen until I started making this list. 1 red counter target artifact, which is neat, but same thing as Guttural Response. It's just too, situational. It is, I suppose, better than the ones that only target blue instants, because every deck can have an artifact. Oh, I mean, what are you getting with this? I guess you can snipe people's soul rings for 1 mana on the stack? It's just, I don't know, I can't see a place where I would play Artifact Blast. If you knew about Artifact Blast and you play it in a commander deck, please let me know. I'm super curious what that deck is. And last but not least is Molten Influence. Red and 1 for an instant, counter target instant or sorcery, unless its controller takes 4 damage from Molten Influence. So Punisher cards like this are generally pretty bad in 60 card formats, because when your opponent has 2 options, they usually choose the one that's best for them. So as the player casting Molten Influence, I'm always getting the worst of 2 options. And in Commander, 4 damage is just not the same as it is in 60 card formats when you have 20 life. So it's just doesn't do enough damage to be relevant, and Punisher cards are just so weak. If I'm casting my combo piece that's going to win the game, yeah, I'll take 4 damage to win the game. Why would I care about the 4 damage? I know I said last but not least, but I think this is actually the worst one. Realized I forgot Warping Whale, which, if I had to put on the tier list, it would actually be in the staple category for colorless decks. If you are totally colorless, this is a great spell. It counters sorceries, which is a tiny bit specific, but it can act as ramp by giving you a Scion, and it can exile creatures. So it's actually really flexible. Okay, so that is my non-blue counterspell tier list. Withering Boon and Lapse of Certainty are my personal favorites, the ones that I play the most. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Would you do this tier list differently? Did I miss any counterspells that should be on the list? And how often do you play these counterspells in your non-blue decks? I'm curious, because I feel like there's a lot of times where I see people just skip over cards like Red Elemental Blast. Either way, thank you so much for watching. Subscribe for more.